Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. I'm at Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on this Wednesday edition of the show, April 19th. A couple days since we've done one of these, and a lot has happened since then. We're going to dive right into the transfer portal because we spoke on Thursday of last week with a couple guys, Trevin Ma'ai, also Keith Brown. They participated in Saturday's scrimmage. Dan Lanning talked about Keith Brown Saturday afternoon. And then shortly after that scrimmage, both Ma'ai and Brown entered the transfer portal. They are gone from the Ducks. Jaleel Tucker, a former top 100 recruit, the first member of Dan Lanning's, I think this is the first member of Dan Lanning's first class, is gone. And he was very high about that.
Hard to remember.
He was very proud that I think in February when we spoke to him, or maybe it was February, and he was very happy that hey, none of our first year guys have left yet. That tells us something, is what he kind of said. Now it has happened. Let's start first though with Brown and Ma'ai because, well, actually all three guys. Which one is more surprising? I think there's three tiers here. I think for Trevin, it was kind of writing on the wall. You're probably going to be out of playing time. It's going to be hard to find playing time here at Oregon. So if you want to play, got to go somewhere else. Keith, I was the most surprised about because he could have been a starter. I don't know. I don't know how likely it was going to be, but he was in contention to win a job. He was going to play a lot in 2023. He played a lot in 2022. We had an awesome Holiday Bowl performance. Tucker did not play a lot last season, but was a top 100 guy, and that's still surprising. A guy gives up, moves on after 1 year with a program.
Yeah, no, I mean, if we're going to rank them, I do think I think I'm in agreement in your order. I mean, I think the Brown part was surprising for a couple of reasons, and we can get into some of that in a moment here, but just in terms of the player and his perceived value, I think he and Trevin both probably played similar number of snaps last year, I would guess. But in terms of who had an opportunity to do more this year, it felt like Keith would be, a nose ahead of Trevin. And I think the funny thing is, if you go back to Thursday, which again is 48 hours before his name hits the portal, two things happen that lead you to believe, look, oh yeah, he's going to be here, and maybe he's going to, as to Matt's point, maybe he has a chance to really win a big role this year. Because earlier in the day, we talked about it on our Friday pod. We watched the 11-on-11 period, and Keith was with the top group on defense as one of the inside linebackers. So there's one check mark of okay, at least he's kind of in contention. And then right after that practice, he talks to media, and the last question he's asked, and I don't want to read the whole quote, but the very last question he's asked is about why he never hit the portal. And he goes and says, I love Oregon. I'm from the state of Oregon. It means more, all of these things. And you're kind of okay, cool. This guy's dialed in, he's locked in. And then he ends up in the portal a couple of days later. So from just a optics perspective, it was kind of strange that sort of is how things took place. I know Trevin spoke on Tuesday a couple of days earlier. I don't think, Jared, I didn't listen to all that interview. I don't think he made such a statement similar to what Keith made. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Not. No.
But still, he had just spoken. So that's two players who had just been made available. And we should also note, Dan, following Saturday scrimmage, it was even we think Keith's going to be great for us. So there's going to be there's good things in his future. So was talking about him in future tense, seemingly in Oregon colors. So, hey, that one sort of surprised me the most. And we can kind of get into sort of the strange nature of college athletics now, where a guy can be, at a school sanctioned media event 1 minute saying he's going to stay at the school, and a couple days later he's in the portal. I think that might be that was the first for me that's happened, but I think we can expect that to be a thing that just is part of the fabric of the portal, which is sort of strange. But I wouldn't expect that. I wouldn't be surprised, I should say, that that could happen multiple times at multiple schools every year, where you get this sort of bizarre situation. So I don't necessarily blame Keith for, by the way, saying that, because if you're told you're going to be speaking that day and you're asked a question about it before you've actually put your name in the portal, you're kind of in a weird spot. Just like, Willie Taggart and Mario Cristobal were kind of in weird spots when they were clearly on the move, but, asked at Oregon sanctioned events. So there's kind of a long-winded way of kind of my Keith response. And I won't go too much more on the other two, because I think they both made more sense just from, I guess, a perceived playing time perspective. Jaleel being somebody who has multiple years after is, of course, disappointing considering he's got 4 years of eligibility, former top 100 recruit, very talented player. But I do think Oregon, if you look at the corner room, certainly has competition there where you could be understanding of his decision to take off.
I think, I don't have any disagreements in your guys' order. It's definitely Keith and then Jaleel and then Trevin, although I think you guys might be Trevin instead of Jaleel. Now that I think back on our conversation that we're having here. Go ahead.
Oh, I actually didn't order them. I would put Trevin above Jaleel just to clarify. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I'd go Jaleel above Trevin. Trevin, the writing's been on the wall for a couple of years now. He's been moving progressively further towards the center, which is also never really a good sign for a guy who was recruited as an outside linebacker. Great kid, had a wonderful interview with him. It was fun. Yeah, he's a good kid. I always enjoyed talking to him. Always enjoyed talking in the smaller media scrums, so there's not as many cameras and kids don't get as nervous. And he's, understandably, he's added more weight because Dan had talked about moving him to D tackle, which is what he was playing while he was still at Oregon. But that's kind of a writing on the wall thing, changing his position for the third or fourth time, depending on how you want to define positional alignments. Tucker just surprised me because he's got 4 more years of eligibility. As a former top 100 recruit, this is a guy who a lot of teams across the country wanted. This is a guy that Oregon went to the mat for against USC and tried to get him and Jaleel Florence. One of those two players, one of the two Jaleels, is now playing. The other one is now no longer on Oregon, and there will be a good list of suitors for Tucker. I think that one just surprised me because
so young.
I don't know. He's got so many years of eligibility. But on the flip side, you have to look at it from the perspective of these players. Trevin Maya wasn't breaking through the rotation. Oregon returned a bunch of starters. He's only got 2 more years of eligibility. He was probably going to play fewer snaps than he did this past season, which was in the low 200 range. And then Jaleel Tucker, Oregon brought in a ton of talent this past offseason, or the past 2 off seasons, really, at the cornerback position. You still have both starters, you still have a starter in Triquez Bridges. You still have Kyrie Jackson, Dante Manning, Jaleel Florence, who's clearly past Tucker on the depth chart. You bring in guys like Dalen Austin and Roderick Pleasant, 2 higher-rated recruits than Jaleel Tucker, 2 guys who are going to be right there competing for playing time. And then you still have guys like Darren Barkins and Avante Dickerson, who I'm not sure where they were on the depth chart in terms of their where they were compared to Tucker, but I think they were all in very similar positions, which was trying to vie for playing time, which was going to be a very difficult dilemma. Lastly, for the Keith Brown thing, I am surprised because he's been such a pro-Oregon person, as a hometown guy. But, a couple things right off the bat. He really didn't play that much this past season. I mean, when you take out the North Carolina game where he played almost 70 snaps, he's down to 130 snaps on the entire team. That's 23rd overall. He played 14 total snaps against Washington, Utah, and Oregon State. So this is going to be my Ryan Russillo moment, where he always talks about this on his podcast. If you don't listen to him, he's an NBA guy. He talks about a lot of sports, but he's traditionally an NBA guy. When you get into the clutch time in an NBA game and you need to bring in your best 5, it's always interesting to see who the coach plays during those 5 minutes, who he trusts the most. When you go back and you look at those big games like Washington and Oregon State and Utah, albeit maybe it's not the best talented guys out there, but those are the 11 dudes that Dan trusts the most, who play the most amount of snaps. When Keith Brown is playing 14 total snaps in 3 games after playing a season high 32 against Colorado, where most of them are in garbage time, I think Dan and company have an idea here. And I'm going to blindly put my faith into Dan and Tosh and that defensive staff and their recruiting philosophies. But I feel okay doing it. And I think that Keith Brown, while I told everybody to relax after the Holiday Bowl game because I knew that was going to be the first thing that comes about, he was certainly in position to get a lot of playing time this season, but it just didn't work. And I think that Dan and company are okay with that.
We'll get to this player and our thoughts on it down the road on this podcast, but Jamal Hill has moved to linebacker, or they're trying to, try that out right now, at least. And that certainly, with Jamal Hill showing up, Justin Jacobs being added to the mix at linebacker, maybe
Connor Sewell
Keith
is another name.
Yeah. Maybe Keith saw the writing on the wall during spring ball And I think we were talking about this in the car on the ride back to practice on Tuesday, the three of us, that maybe Keith got into the scrimmage on Saturday, get some film and use it to put out there that, hey, this is what I can do. This is who I am on the field. I'm hitting the portal. I've got some really recent film in a game situation. This is what I look like, and here we go. It certainly is one that makes you kind of go, oh wow, okay, didn't expect that. I think we've certainly all covered our thoughts on it, and it's going to be interesting to see how it impacts Oregon, down the road, because this is a unit where, like, I don't know if they're like in dire straits of a linebacker depth, but they're also not loaded with it either. I don't feel like, at least right now for spring ball, maybe that's where Oregon goes in the portal. If they find a player on the defensive side of the football that they like, they've got certainly bigger issues on the offensive side. But maybe it's a linebacker that they add in the portal if they decide to do it.
My only pushback, and I'll make it pretty slight because I understand it's a snapshot, and that was kind of how we framed it last week with the 11-on-11 about Keith skipping town purely because he saw the writing on the wall with playing time, as he was given an opportunity, or at least that we saw he was the first team with the first group defense. I think that sort of just was the one thing that gives me a little hesitation, going like, yeah, he must have just looked up and seen Justin's ahead of me, Jamal's ahead of me, all these guys are ahead of me, because the one time we've actually watched him do 11-on-11, that wasn't the case. And again, why I say slight, because I understand that's a really small snapshot of practice, and it's possible that every other period they've done in competition, he's been with the threes, and he's been lagging behind and whatnot. It's possible, and it's possible, to Matt's point, that the scrimmage went really poorly for him and really well for two or three other players he's competing for playing time. And the sense coming out of it was that those players are on the up and up, and that he's on the downswing. Like, it's possible that that's took place, but that was the only reason I kind of thought it was, not the only, but it was one of the chief reasons I thought it was strange, was just that if it was entirely playing time related, which I think is the sense that a lot of people have had, that doesn't jive with what we had actually seen at that one practice period. And again, I don't want to make too much out of it, but that would be the, again, slight pushback I would offer to that narrative. And I'll be very curious to kind of see where he lands and what role he lands. Because I think he's a player with some upside. And I think at Oregon, to Matt's point, like, it's not like they're stockpiled with talent at that position, especially experienced talent, if you look at it. And maybe we should have the Jamal Hill question or conversation now. I'm just thinking because it kind of ties right in. But you do look at where Oregon is at inside linebacker, and you go, okay, the guy who was with Keith in that first team is Jeffrey Boss, a player who I think we've been pretty open and honest and upfront about. I think I still have confidence he can become a good player, but certainly what he showed last year is he has a lot of work to do. The second team was, I believe, Jamal Hill and Connor Sewell. Sewell's a guy who didn't have a whole lot of production at ASU. Jamal Hill, as we'll get to, is a converted nickel deep safety, now linebacker, so he's moved around a lot. And then the third group was Justin Jacobs, a player I think we're very high on, who's coming back from injury, and Devin Jackson, a true freshman who, again, redshirt, played I think the first 4 games, and we didn't see him again until the bowl game. So it's not like you look at that and go like, man, Keith Brown's looking around going, man, this is heavy hitters. So maybe I'm being underselling some of the skill sets of these guys, because so many of them I haven't seen in person, and it's possible that Devin Jackson's taking huge strides, and Sewell and Justin Jacobs are much better than I'm giving them credit for. And again, I'm also already pretty high on Jacobs, but I just think it's interesting kind of looking at the group, and why I thought maybe we could talk about Jamal Hill is he spoke with media on Tuesday, and I'll let Jared do the heavy lifting here because he was the one conducting a lot of the interview. But I came away really encouraged and kind of excited by what was said on that interview. I don't know, somebody lives above me, and it sounds like they just did like a power squat jump or something. I have no idea. It was just like, whoosh. Congratulations, you made the podcast, guys. But I was just going to say, I was just intrigued by, he gave his weight. I'll let Jared share it. It's close to the numbers we were talking about before, and I just think a guy with his skill set, movement skills, the player who I thought had some really nice moments playing in the box at nickel, albeit in a different spot, like, I kind of get excited by the idea of what he could be. So I'll let Jared take it over from here in terms of telling more of the Jamal story. But I just came away from that interview thinking, gosh, Keith leaves. That's not ideal, but maybe Jamal is just going to step in and be somebody who can really be a contributor here, who I feel like maybe I'm overlooking because it's a new position for him.
Yeah, I don't blame you for being excited about the prospect of Jamal Hill turning into a real 4-2-5 linebacker. And we've talked about many a times in this podcast how we felt that Jamal was just a better nickel player than he was a free safety. I still feel that way, even though now that he's a linebacker, if he had to go back there, I would say he needs to go play at nickel rather than free safety. And this process, according to Jamal, started very shortly after Oregon's bowl victory in the Holiday Bowl over North Carolina. He said that early January, he called Dan, he called Tosh Lupoy, he called his family, and they kind of talked about how can he continue to try and achieve his goals, which is from listening to the interview and kind of rereading it. Seems like it's to go to the next level, which is basically everybody's goal at the collegiate football level. How can he continue his goals to get to the next level while helping the team? And Dan basically said, Jamal, there's a lot of guys with your size, your fluidity, your athleticism who do really well inside the box. And that means moving to linebacker. And Jamal Hill said, yeah, I'll do it. And Jamal kind of likened it to how he played nickel safety for Oregon in the past. He felt like his skill set kind of works inside the box as well. He just has to. I think the biggest issue, the one that he kept referring to, was the physicality. Everybody's a lot bigger inside the box, is what he said, which makes a lot of sense because he's a safety. If he does come down into the box, he'll be taking on a tight end. He'll be taking on a running back. He'll be taking on a slot receiver, someone who's trying to block him. This time, if he shoots the A or B gap, he's running into a 300-pound offensive lineman. And because of that, he's added some weight. He says he's up to 227 pounds, which is up from his 212 pounds this past season. I think the added weight is very noticeable. It's something that we all noticed on the very first day. He and Jeffrey Bassa, I don't think Jeffrey Bassa has flat out told how much he weighs. He did mention that he weighs like 10 to 15 pounds more, just like Jamal. But Jamal's 227. He's comfortable playing at that weight. He thinks that he hasn't lost any speed from his weight gain. He's pretty comfortable playing there at that number at 227, but he would be open to adding more weight. I think that would probably behoove him. But overall, I don't blame you, Erik, for potentially being excited about this transition to linebacker. He's got a kind of a natural skill set to be a modern day cover linebacker, which is, what's going on in college football and even the NFL at this point. You don't see a lot of guys who are built like Brian Bosworth anymore. That's 6'2", 240 to 50 pound linebacker, and you saw that with Noah Sewell. And, I know Sewell was hurt for most of the season, as he said in his NFL combine interviews. So it's a big difference between his sophomore to his junior season. But, there were moments where he was a step slow out there. There were moments where a guy his size is going to be a step slow out there, especially when you go against prolific offenses like USC is going to be running next season. So I think that this is a move for the better. This might play very much into why Keith Brown decided it was time to go. But we'll find out eventually, but it was a good interview with Jamal. He credits the nutrition shakes that he gets from Oregon sports nutritionists and 4 meals a day as to how he gained so much weight pretty fast. And 4 meals a day will do that to you.
He also shared he does his 300 push-ups in sets of 50, by the way, just an update.
He does.
Oh, so it's
correct.
So it's not all
sets
in
of 50.
like.
No, it's not continuous.
Good Lord.
Did we find out how long it takes him to do 300 push-ups? Because it's
if he sets a 60, that shouldn't be that much, or 50.
That's what one set in probably 90 seconds, 2 minutes.
I feel like that'd be taking it slow. You're just down up.
And I don't think he did those. I think there were breaks in between. It sounded like it didn't seem like it was 50 and then wait 2 minutes, do 50. Anyway, we and we should note also multiple guys in the 300 push-up club, which
started by Bucky Irving.
There you go.
Yeah, we got a Bucky Irving shout out during the Jamal Hill interview. If you watch the video of it, I'll be curious. Word's getting out on that. How many guys joined the 300 push-up club? Because guys like to get kind of recognition for that type of stuff.
Well, he listed them.
I know, but how many more join?
Now
that it's become public knowledge that.
It's a good question, Matt. I could see it. Yeah, you could see it being. It's like 4 or 5 right now. Maybe it gets to 12 by the end of spring or something.
All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we've got some more clarity on some tight end news with Oregon, with Terrance Ferguson out, as well as some other notes from the last couple of days of practice. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Another item that happened over the weekend on Saturday was Terrance Ferguson being out for. Actually, we haven't talked about this on the podcast. Now that I think about it,
we have not.
Terrance Ferguson out for spring football. That's not breaking news because it's old news. But if somehow you haven't made it to duckterritory.com, shame on you. You should. That's been on there since Saturday. But he's out for the remainder of spring ball with an undisclosed injury. The ramifications of that means Oregon has 2 scholarship tight ends now for the rest of spring. This was something that Jared has been banging his drum for months now.
I've been saying this since February, January. Yeah. I'm glad. I mean, not that I'm glad it happened, but I'm glad that I'm right. I'm just glad I'm right. And although I thought it would be Patrick Herbert who might have an injury concern, it turned out to be Terrance Ferguson. But I'm just glad I'm right. Yeah, that's all.
Oregon's now in a bad spot. They were already maybe in a bad spot. Now it's gotten worse because they just have 2. Patrick Herbert and Kenyon Sadiq. Erik, Drew Mehringer, the tight ends coach, he spoke about this. Dan Lanning has spoke about this as well. And then we got even more clarity of it on Tuesday that they're going to be active in the portal.
Yeah, and that was, I think, already the case. This just, as I think we suggested maybe to each other after the injury, is just this really puts on display of boy, when they don't have Ferguson out there. Actually, we said this in the podcast before we knew how significant it was in terms of just the depth of breaking down the different fastball periods last Friday. But it's just really clear they just don't have a lot of bodies. We already knew this, and I think it's not surprising at all that both Mehringer and Lanning, I don't think have either said we will be using the portal to add tight ends, but both have said we will be actively looking for ways to improve the situation or add to the room. So pretty clearly what they're talking about. And we should say they aren't just, there are actions, not just words here, because they did go out and offer, I think it was on Monday, North Texas tight end, Varkey's Gums, who's an all-conference player in the Conference USA this last year. Pretty similar size and build to Kenyon Sadiq. I don't know how much we want to go into breakdowns here because it's possible he doesn't end up at Oregon, but that's certainly, I think, maybe just a name to know. But yeah, no, there's no question about it right now, and the Ferguson injury, just to be clear, I don't think there's any indication that's going to keep him out of fall at all. This is, I think even Dan said this is being pretty careful with them. They're being, they're trying to be cautious here because it is so far away from the season, but you have to have answers, man, because this just shows you really clearly what it's like with one of these guys out. I mean, with the third team tight end was Landon Shepard, a guy who I'm guessing a lot of you listening to this podcast, you've just heard his name for the first time. So, they're going to be active and it makes sense. And another element of this, I thought it was kind of notable on Tuesday. I did ask Dan of who are some players currently on the roster capable of filling in? Because Dan did at least kind of acknowledge that was a possibility. And the 3 names he gave would probably surprise, or at least some of them would. Mateo Uiagalelei, which I don't think is overly surprising. I actually looked this up and had forgotten that he was an all-state tight end at St. John Bosco. I know he's a very productive offensive player, but didn't realize to the length that he had been successful. And then the other 2, Jake Shipley and Josh Connolly Jr. And I just thought it was kind of notable to throw Josh's name out there. I think just as kind of pointing out how ridiculous this whole thing is that we're talking about the depth in spring, right? I mean, it's just in terms of how it matters because Josh Connolly's not out there actively taking practice reps away from his left tackle work to go run, work on his, inline blocking as a tight end or work on his out routes. I don't think that's something he was devoting any practice time to. But I think really what Dan was saying there was like, we have options, but gosh, I hope none of these guys have to play a single snap at tight end ever in their careers here. But they certainly do have options to if things get worse. But again, I think it just points to the fact that they have to go find at least one scholarship tight end. And like, shoot, like, I don't know. Do you guys feel good at 3? Or yeah, I know. Maybe
you need 2.
Maybe you need to go add 2.
They've always needed 2. You can't have 3 scholarship tight ends with one having a significant injury concern and one being a true freshman. I won't go into my speech because I've said this so many times, and it's just how it is. But the one thing I want to say though is the Dan saying like, oh, Mateo and Jake Shipley and Josh Connor, that's just all nonsense. There's no way any of those guys are actually repping a tight end. It was, Dan originally was like, yeah, we got some guys on a roster who could fill in and play tight end. And I think, Erik, you asked him again, like, who are some of those people, Dan, since you said it in public? And Dan's like, well, I know Josh Connolly played tight end last year. I know that Mateo Uyunglele played tight end in high school, and Jake Shipley is a guy who's tall and kind of athletic. But more importantly, guys, he then finally admits to, yeah, we're looking. We are looking for a guy who can help us in that position room because we are thin, and we're going to look for a guy who can help us basically immediately and a guy who fits the program. I just think that Dan it seemed like he kind of backed himself into a corner and then finally had to admit, it's like, yes, we are looking for guys in our tight end room because we desperately need one. And that's not to say that Ferguson's injury is going to be everlasting, that it's going to be like a season injury or season-long injury.
No.
I think it's right for Oregon to be precautious because he's your best tight end. For Terrance, it's kind of going to make an NBA reference again. It's kind of like a rest day. It's kind of like, Kawhi, take the day off. This is spring camp. Terrance Ferguson doesn't need to know how to do things in spring camp. He's been around here for a while. He's a good player. Guys like Kenyon Sadiq, sure. So they're going to take their time with Ferguson, and I think that's the right thing to do. For tight end measures, there's probably not going to be a ton of tight ends in the transfer portal who are going to be an instant impact guy, but Gums, like you mentioned, out of North Texas, is a real impact guy. Alabama had a 4-star freshman. I think he might have been a sophomore at this point. Transfer. I don't think he's played in any games at Alabama, but he was a 4-star Alabama prospect. So, maybe kick the tires on that. I think there will be options. Certainly, I think it also helps that Oregon is a school that practices on the quarter system. So, if there is a guy who's in the transfer portal who would like to come and visit Oregon for an official visit, not only can he come see the campus and hopefully see it on a sunny day, but he can come to practice. He can see how these guys operate. He can see how they scrimmage if he comes on a Saturday, which is more than likely. He can just see how the whole program works as a whole. And I think that's really important, unlike other schools who are just on the semester schedule where their football might be over and it's just going to meet the staff. And I know that's going to be it's going to be important for those players to meet all the staff and coaching personnel as well. But I think it helps Oregon when they're able to show off, this is what practice looks like. This is how we coach our tight ends. This is how we do X, Y, and Z. So I think the tight end issue is a real thing right now. And I think there's going to be options in the portal, but I don't know if there's going to be like hey, this is the clear-cut guy that we have to go after. But regardless, I think they need to add one, but I really think they need to add 2 tight ends.
Gums is going to be on campus at Arkansas this weekend for an official visit. Utah has also offered him a scholarship. I think Baylor has offered him a scholarship. Obviously, Oregon has
a bunch of other Pac-12 schools. There's like about 4 or 5 of them, I think.
Yeah, I do worry about the prospects of getting him. Because he's already locked in a visit to Arkansas pretty quickly. That's pretty telling. He's originally from Houston. It's not a long trip to get to Arkansas out there to check out that program. It's close to home-ish. And I wonder, I don't know what Arkansas or, we know Utah has to replace Dalton Kincaid. I don't know what Arkansas's depth chart is like. If they've got like a totally open tight end room, it's open competition for everybody. That's not the case at Oregon, unless Ferguson's injury, and then they communicate that in the recruiting process. Like, hey, Ferguson's going to be out for 3 months, and he's going to be just getting back around fall camp, and you got a good chance to maybe start the first couple of games, then split time, what have you. And that's just a scenario. We don't know the status is. I have a hard time seeing a guy that started at North Texas that's looking for a bigger school to come and be on the bench at Oregon, unless he's under the understanding that, like, hey, T. Ferg is gone in a year, and maybe it's your job the next year, and he's cool with that. I don't know. I think it's going to be hard to find a real instant impact guy in the portal, if there is one. Gums feels like he could be. He had a really good freshman season, but I feel like it's going to be this is going to be a test for Oregon's staff to really sell how, this position, because there's not a clear direct path to playing time, at least right now.
There's not a clear path to starting, but there's a clear path to playing time.
Yes.
Jared, did you have something?
Most certainly. Yeah, I was just gonna Gums is 6'3", 230, and Erik, you mentioned it. He's like Kenyon Sadiq size, and that's a different type of tight end than Oregon has in the roster. Ferguson is like 6'6", Herbert's 6'6". They're both bigger boys, and that is my sell to Gums to come to Oregon. Is that, hey, you're a modern day pass catching tight end. You're a little undersized, but that's what Will Stein used at Texas or UTSA. That's a guy who he would utilize in this offense. That's what they brought Kenyon Sadiq in for. So they have an idea. They have a role potentially for Gums as you might not be a starter every game, but neither was Terrance Ferguson last year.
Sure.
It was Maliki Matavau So if you really care about the I don't know, the asterisk next to your name that indicates that you started, maybe, don't come to Oregon. But I think, a guy like that with his versatility, his skill set, he's going to get playing time, and he's going to, I would imagine, do well in this type of offense.
And I will. Can I jump in? I just had one thought on that too, which is to my point about playing time, which I was just going to mention, is that even last year, I think we were all surprised by how evenly or quasi-evenly the split was between the four guys who played. Sure. It was really just the top three, right? It was Ferguson, Matavau, and McCormick, I think, all played within like 100 snaps. And Herbert played quite a few less, but enough where you're like, okay, that's 15, 20 snaps maybe a game or whatever. Maybe not 20, but maybe 10, 15 snaps per game for Herbert. I don't remember the exact number. So there is a possibility to pitch that to Gums of like, hey, maybe Ferguson, to Jared's point too, like Ferguson didn't start every game. Maybe there are certain packages and situations where Gums is on the field to start, but I think you could pitch him on, hey, you can be one of the four tight ends that plays a lot, and you could probably be at worst the number 2 guy on our depth chart. Come here, have a role, and then develop. And then to your point, Matt, like it's very possible. I mean, I think Ferguson has a huge ceiling as an NFL player just based upon his skill set. I don't know if that means three and gone, but it's possible it does. And if that's the case, Gums could be not coerced, but convinced, like, hey, come here for a year, be the de facto number 2. The next year it's your job. So I do think they could sell it, but to your original point, it is an interesting thing where Oregon has to be selective in who they go after, but the players are going to be kind of selective in where they want to go. And maybe for Gums, I don't know. I also don't know Arkansas's tight end situation, but maybe Arkansas's situation is they return no good scholarship tight ends, and it's like, come here and you are starting, and that's going to be hard to probably compete with. But I do think you can at least make an offer for some playing time, even if it's not a starting role.
Matt, I just saw your post on the board. Malachi Hannah is off to the portal.
Breaking news.
Why didn't we lead the podcast with this?
It didn't happen until midway through the podcast.
You should have interrupted whoever was speaking. This is a disaster.
Do we want to inform the listeners that Malachi Hannah was on their favorite football team until now?
Well,
that's really mean.
They all should have known that. You guys all should have known that Malachi Hannah was an outside linebacker from Simi Valley. So,
and we should know walk-on player who hit the portal. While we were doing this,
walk-on linebacker.
Best of luck to Malachi. I know we've laughed a lot there, but yeah, good. Hope he lands somewhere and has an opportunity.
Can't believe you guys didn't take that seriously, my lord. Especially you, Erik, of all people in our walk-on drafts.
I didn't take him in the walk-on draft. He's probably on Matt. He's probably on your team. That's probably one of your guys.
Probably.
Yeah.
I can't even remember my walk-on draft.
Neither can I. But we'll should do a live stream of that this season.
It could be fun.
Chris Hampton, new co-defensive coordinator, safeties coach. First time we got to speak with him on Tuesday, and got an interesting decision to come to Oregon because we didn't know this. We were talking about this before the show, that we didn't realize it until he actually said it on Tuesday, but he was in charge of calling plays at Tulane defensively. Willie Fritz, the head coach, he said gave him the keys to do it, was hands off as long as it worked. And it worked pretty good for the Tulane Green Wave. They made one of the big bowls this past season. They beat USC in the Cotton Bowl. And now Hampton relinquished play calling duties to come to Oregon as a co-DC. And it was an interesting conversation nonetheless. And I feel like we're a broken record, at least I am, when we meet these these new assistant coaches that Lanning has hired. I always come away pretty impressed. Level-headed, mature, very smart, very forward-thinking, big picture type guys. And this is just another one. Chris Hampton was a very good interview, and his perspective on why he would give up play calling duties to come to Oregon was pretty cool.
And I guess first off, I'm 3 for 3 getting a handshake and a nice to meet you from all 3 new coaches. So gotta love that. That's a nice record to have. And I'm in agreement that I thought Hampton was excellent, as have all the new coaches, in terms of kind of communicating their story and their vision for the position or offense or kind of whatever their responsibilities are. And to Matt's point on the Hampton thing, like, yeah, I obviously was familiar with his, role and responsibility, or should say his role was at Tulane in terms of having a defensive coordinator title, but I wasn't under the impression that he was the only play caller, that wasn't a split duty. That's somewhat significant that a coach would leave one situation to come here. But he did speak to the fact that, he had some, I guess, trepidations with that whole concept of doing that himself, but that Dan and Tosh are 2 people he really respected, and they sold them on this growth mindset idea, right? That, we had Dan on the podcast not long ago. He talked about some of that. If you guys haven't listened to that show, I highly recommend you go ahead and take a listen. But just that really kind of, I guess, struck a chord with Hampton, who also, we should note, had kind of developed a bit of a friendship with Dan and some of the Oregon staffers over the last couple of years through coaching clinics and the camp circuit and stuff. So he already had a previous relationship, but just clearly he came away from that conversation thinking, okay, I'm going to use some time in Eugene to learn, even if that doesn't mean I have all the responsibilities I've had in the past. And I think it sounds like somebody who is taking this time very seriously, just like previous coaches who took their jobs here very seriously and benefited by getting a big job the next year. I'm not saying I think Hampton's a one and done at Oregon, but just knowing his background and the way he's approaching this year, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he has a Kenny Dillingham or a Matt Powledge sort of trajectory here, where pretty quickly he's able to go and take a step up, whether that be probably as a defensive coordinator, maybe at a bigger school, but he's already got that defensive, again, that play calling, that history. To Matt's point, the defenses weren't bad at all at Tulane under his leadership. So I'm going to be very curious to kind of see the improvement from the safety group, because I thought that's a position that needs some work. We talked about it. But then also, what is his path? Because I could see this being a short-term marriage here, where he's here for a year or two, spend some time learning under Tosh and Dan and all these defensive guys. Already has his defensive play calling history. I've already mentioned that, and takes off to a bigger school, or I should say a bigger opportunity as a defensive coordinator somewhere.
Yeah, I would be surprised if he lasted a couple of years here. I think that's just that's kind of how it is in college football. You look at Matt Powledge, who was Baylor's I think he was a co-DC and a special teams coordinator at Baylor. He comes to Oregon for a year. He has the year with the safeties, and you can say how Oregon safeties played if you'd like. It was an up and down season, to say the least, and boom, he gets promoted to defensive coordinator back at Baylor. So I think adding Hampton to the staff is a significant upgrade. I was surprised at it by the time, because again, like you guys have mentioned, it was interesting that he gave up the full-time play calling duties to come be a co-DC and a safeties coach basically across the country from Tulane. But he did. And I think he's going to be a very welcomed addition to the staff. Like Erik said, I'm very interested to see how the safeties perform with this new coaching philosophy, with a new group of people as well, a new couple safeties in the room. So, I mean, I'm interested to see all that. I unfortunately did not get to talk to Chris Hampton, so I think I'm 0 for 0 on handshakes from coaches this year because I haven't talked to any of the new guys. I've just been going after the one-on-one interviews that I enjoy so much, where I get to ask a bunch of random questions to players. But I'm glad you guys both got your handshakes. Chris, if you're listening, I hope you are.
I didn't get my handshakes. It's just Chris. It's just Eric. He's the only one.
Oh
yeah.
I was behind the camera.
Yeah. Well, what happened
Chris,
was
I'll be waiting.
He didn't. Yeah. Well, Chris, if you're listening to this podcast, which I know he won't be, why would he? That'd be very strange. He was like, "Oh yeah, I heard on the podcast. You want me to come shake your hand, Jared? Hello, my name's Chris." No, he came off the interview. Had been interviewing running back Jordan James, and we kind of just met and quick handshake. He saw the hat and said, "Oh, you must work for 24/7." I said, "Yes, I certainly do." It'd be weird if I actually no, you're right. Actually, no, I work for Sports Illustrated. I just like that.
I came off the street. Yeah.
Eventually, happened. That happened for the coaches clinic. A fan literally signed up for the coaches clinic and just walked right in, paid the dues, got to go through the whole thing.
Huh. That's sounds like not a bad idea. Maybe we should do that next year.
You know, I took a coaching class in college. I think I still got some old textbooks, so maybe I can go and
go under
pay
disguise.
All the fees and go under disguise as Leroy Brown and go from there.
I thought it was interesting when Hampton talked. I asked him kind of like, "What are you looking for your safeties?" To the traits that they have to have, and I think the thing that he mentioned first was he needs guys to communicate, because in this defense they're going to be ones that setting everything up.
Yep.
And he singled out Steve Stevens as the guy that's maybe their best communicator. And it's going to be interesting. We've talked about it at length before on this podcast, just the safety position as a group. And it really feels like there might not be like a Javon Holland or a Verone McKinley who's just like exceptionally good at basically everything, but they're going to have a rotation of guys that they've got a lot of guys that can do a lot of different things, just based off what he said and what they're looking for in players. Where we could see matchup type lineups for who they play week in, week out.
Yeah, and this is, I think, not surprised at all. Steve was singled out as the best communicator, the best football mind. Like when Verone was here, he and those three, which along with Javon, were known to be film junkies, known to be really high football IQ players. And I never have had any issue with Steve's football IQ. The issue has been some of the physical limitations I think I've just seen in terms of maybe lack of being able to open up and run with some of the faster players. But to Matt's point, but then that's where Brian Addison is like a huge benefit he can cover probably more area than just about anybody out there with that frame and the speed and the length and the ball skills, which I know Hampton talked about. Evan Williams is somebody who's probably closer to Steve Stevens in terms of size and athletic stuff, but I think has a little bit more pop. And so, yeah, I think you're right though, across the board, it's an interesting kind of blend. And I think that was the issue at times last year, whereas you wanted to have a Steve Stevens out there because he was probably your smartest guy. He probably was. And to Chris Hampton's point, it's really important to have a guy back there who can kind of be the eyes and the ears of the coaching staff, if you will, in terms of getting everything set up, getting you out of different, coverages and making audibles and all that stuff. And I think Steve's probably near the top there. But the question is, can he do all the rest of the things you need from that position group? And that's where I don't have an answer. So he's a very interesting player for me because I think he's super valuable out there, but at times his lack of ability to do certain things can kind of really hurt you defensively. And I'll be very curious just to see kind of where all of this lands, and not to deviate too much, but I do also think it's kind of notable that the last two times Dan has spoke, he's mentioned there's been some successful deep shots over the top of the defense. And that doesn't necessarily, again, reading between the lines, doesn't necessarily mean the safeties did anything wrong, but that was an issue last year. And I just kind of wonder what their plans are to get that rectified, because when you hear that, part of me pricks up and goes, Will Steins, he came in, he said he's going to take deep shots. It's working in practice. But the other part goes, well, that's to Jared's point earlier. These guys are all on the same team. And that means someone on defense probably is getting beaten and probably didn't do very well. So.
Yeah, it was Tez Johnson this last time, according to Dan, who when asked if anybody is faster, he talked about it, a completely new guy coming to the team and being fast. So there you go. That's who's fast. But for Steve, this is his final year at Oregon. This is his time for him to step up, and like Erik said, there's no surprise that he's the guy who was mentioned in the conversation of being the guy who's communicating the most amongst the safeties. That's kind of been his MO in the last couple of seasons. That's the guy, like Erik said, that has been brought up multiple times about who's the best communicator back there. I would say the lone issue with that is he might not be the best safety on the team. And I think that could be considered putting it lightly, although Steve's a wonderful kid. But you're hoping that guys like Evan Williams and Tysheem Johnson, who are transfers and are new to the program. I know Evan's brother Bennett was here, and he can help him out with the play calling and the communication from that perspective as well. But you're hoping that those guys learn the system well, and they learn it fast, and they're able to figure out some of the downfalls that happened last season at the safety position. I do think that Oregon's safety room is much deeper this year than it was last season. Guys like Brian Addison, Steve Stevens being potentially, if we want to go off the fastball period, 11 on 11, the second group instead of Tysheem and Evan Williams and JJ Greenfield. I think that is a positive sign. I think that's a really positive sign because Steve Stevens and Brian Addison were at points were starters last season. And for that kind of experience, that kind of talent, skill set to come off the bench, I think that's really good. I think they can come down in specific situations, but there is a lot of room for improvement in that room. And that's what I mentioned when we talked about Hampton again. That's going to be something that you keep your eye on. And for the deep shots, like Erik said, that was what, that's what did him in against Washington a couple of times. That's what, it was other things against Oregon State and Utah, but, Washington State, I know Oregon won that game, but they were down by a bundle to start. And there were some D shots. There were some miscommunications on the defensive backs at points during that game. So these are things to watch. And luckily, it's just spring, and there's a whole lot of time until the season starts. But that's it. That's all I got.
I really wish we could get into practice to see.
Yeah, me too.
I think, we talked about this last season too. It's like, it'd be cool. Dan,
just let us in. I mean, the spring game's going to kind of show us something a little bit, but just to see how this group is working, because there's a lot of combinations. There's a lot of, options that they have at the safety spot. And it's just going to be interesting to see. Do we know what Trajan Williams is doing? Do we know where he's at? This is an All-American, and he didn't get on the field much last season. Where is he in the picture? What are the two new guys, the two freshmen that enrolled early, and Ty Turner and Cody DeCambra? Where are they at? Can they play? Do they need a red shirt? How big of an impact has Tysheem Johnson had? The list just goes on and on. And then we could say this also about a lot of position groups. No doubt about it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think honestly, we've talked a lot about three position groups on this podcast: tight end, safety, linebacker. Those are three of the position groups I'm probably most intrigued to watch the spring game, just being honest, in terms of, because a lot of the personnel I haven't seen at Oregon, if you just go through the list. And a lot of the personnel I have seen at Oregon have either been playing different positions or haven't really played much at all. So there are, and those are three positions that ultimately will have obviously a really big impact on the season next year, because let's be honest, I think linebacker and safety were two positions that weren't Oregon's best a year ago. And those are positions where they spent quite a bit of equity from a player perspective of going out and acquiring new players, whether it be high school, whether it be portal players, if they've made a lot of effort there. New position coach at safety. Obviously, that wasn't in response to poor safety play necessarily, because Palage got essentially a promotion to go back to Baylor. But no, I think I'm really curious with those groups just to see how this plays out. And honestly, if there's one guy, this podcast has convinced me the one guy I guess I'm most excited to watch is Jamal Hill in the spring game. I just want to see how do those movement skills, which I always thought impressed me quite a bit for a person who was, I know, not a massive safety, but a pretty big person out there. I always thought that translated even at 211. I'm curious to see what that looks like at 227. I'm curious to see how his instincts carry over. I always thought he played pretty well in the box. How is he in coverage? All of these things I'm just curious to see Jamal Hill, because that's such a clear area where they need to fill something. And if you just have a player on the roster who you can kind of reshape and reform into a different type of player and it work out, like that's a huge win for this offseason for Oregon, where you didn't have to go out and hit the portal. I know they did to grab a couple of guys, but that you were able to in-house rectify some things. So his development, I guess even Jeffrey Boss is next to him. That linebacker is right there. I guess I'm just really curious to see how those guys are looking. I know we're getting ahead here because the spring game is still I'm not sure, 12 days away.
2 weeks.
Like that. But
Or 10 days.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I'm excited about.
Yeah. Are we doing what are we excited about for the spring game thing?
No, because if you want to,
that.
I just dawning on me. I was off the cuff. So if you guys want to, go ahead. We got some time if you want, but I don't know.
I'm excited.
I'm
for
good.
Jordan Birch. Yeah, we've only heard a lot of good things. We've asked the defensive line every time that we interview somebody from there, like, "Hey, what'd you think of Jordan Birch?" Everybody says that he's a freak. He's a freak athlete. That he's got a deep bag. For those listening who don't know what a bag is, it's a great tool belt. He's got a lot of moves he can go to. I forgot who said it, but it might have been Trevin who, see you later. But he mentioned that Birch jumped up, caught a pass, intercepted it, and then basically took it to the house. He's been compared to Jadeveon Clowney, Kayvon Thibodeau by some people, although that was quickly walked back about the Thibodeau stuff, but makes sense. I'm just excited to see what it looks like in person. He's already a big boy, and from what everybody has said, except for the coaching staff, he could be a legitimate game changer. And with him on one end and Dorless on the other, I think that'll be exciting.
All right. I'll save mine for later.
All right.
Ooh.
What am I excited for? Offense.
Nice.
I'm a points guy. I hate games that are, sorry, Dan, defensive oriented. I want to see shootouts. So we know what Bo can do, but skill wise, offensively at the receiver positions beyond Troy Franklin. I'm excited to see how Tez fits into the offense. I'm excited to see what Kyle Casper can do at receiver. What's Ashton Cozart bring to the table? An early enrollee at freshman for a receiver position. Kenyon Sadiq. Yeah. I'm excited to see a lot of Patrick Herbert, to be honest. What can he do? What can he relied on to do? And then just the offensive line combination. The offensive line, it's tough because they're going to mix and match, and you're going to have guys playing next to each other who don't play next to each other, or who won't play next to each other all that often. But just kind of maybe who are the 10 guys that they throw together for the starting units for either side. That's going to be telling. Not necessarily how they play, but just who those guys are.
Just one last thing. I guess we don't know for sure what the format is for the scrimmage.
We do not.
It could be that it is 1s v 1s and 2s vs 2s, 3s vs 3s. I don't know. I'm saying V's like that, but
it seems to be,
or it could be what it was last year, to Matt's point, where they did a draft and split it up.
That seems to be the trend, though, in college football in the spring games. I watched dozens of them this past weekend. It's 1v1. It's the defense scores points, like how Mario used to do it. Where it's 3 and out is 4 points or whatever it is. I would be down for that.
No.
Oh. Yes. I need it.
As long as it's not the
2s and 2s.
As long as it's not the system from, I think it was 2013. Remember that was where Aliotti was wait, they didn't score any points. Why did the offense win?
First down. You get the offense gets a point for a first down or something like that.
Yeah, the defense got a point for forcing a punt, but it ended up being the offense scored 2. I don't know. I'm not actually sure how many it was, but not very many touchdowns, and the defense ended up losing 80 to 25 or something.
I think we're gonna get an actual game because Dan was asked earlier, what are your thoughts on potentially playing another school in the spring? Because I guess that's kind of what the UAB coach is trying to push down in the South. And he said last year he would have been okay with that idea because it didn't have enough depth for a full-on game between themselves. they had the depth for just like a game versus an opponent. Whereas this year, he said that they have a lot better depth and more guys to play, and he wants to see his team play against each other to get a better feel for what they have for the full roster. Which, to me, I interpreted it as, hey, we want to play a game against ourselves, like a legit game.
Yeah, I hope they do that. I think they will. And I guess to your point also, if Dan is saying a year ago we didn't have the depth to really have enough to go 1v1, maybe this year he feels like they do, and we do see them shift over to something where it is kind of a version of top group. That's what I would much prefer to see. That you'd learn more, obviously, but then also like I think it would be, to Jared's point, also like, remember last year DJ Johnson just absolutely cooked like Feope and Bailey Jaramillo in the spring game, and we were like, oh my gosh, you guys
Bailey
amazing.
Jaramillo, no disrespect, but
I would love to see Jordan Birch go up against like Josh Connerly for like an hour rather than go up against Michael
100%.
Wooten or somebody who's I think going to be a good player, but that's not going to teach us very much about Jordan Birch.
Let the big dogs eat Dan.
I agree. All right, it's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you for listening to the show. We'll be back Friday morning with another edition after we speak with some coaches, some players, we watch some practice. Who else? What else may happen between now and Friday? But until then, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.